Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 6 for History 102. And what we're going to be talking about first of all today are the events that lead to the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. Now, as you probably gathered by now, President Andrew Johnson was not very popular by the time 1867 rolls around. He had alienated the radical Republicans in Congress with his crazy vetoes and campaign against the 14th Amendment. And in fact, Southerners weren't that happy with him because of the way that he made them personally come in for pardons and so forth. Now, one thing that we need to establish right off the bat so you can understand how this all pans out for Johnson. Remember, Johnson took over in April of 1865 when Abraham Lincoln was tragically assassinated. He will inherit Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, and the overwhelming majority of them had been with Lincoln since the beginning when he took office in 1861. And his cabinet officials weren't exactly happy with him because they were all loyal Republicans, and most of them would have been considered radical Republicans. So what's going on here is the Senate, controlled by the radical Republicans, as we talked about before, have a spy on Johnson's cabinet, one of Lincoln's appointees. And that person is the Secretary of War. Now, back in this day and age, it was the War Department, and the person in charge of it was known as Secretary of War, unlike today, where it's the Defense Department with the Secretary of Defense. And the person that I'm referring to is Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Stanton could not stand Johnson. So after every cabinet meeting, Stanton would walk down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol and report to the leadership of the Senate and tell them what had just gone on in the cabinet meetings. He was a very close friend with the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts. So the Senate and the House, they'd relay these messages to their radical Republican colleagues in the House, were always one step ahead of Johnson and his political strategy. Now, this had been going on for quite some time. And Johnson, not being the brightest bulb on the tree, so to speak, it took him forever to figure this out. So, finally, he catches wind that the reason why the Senate always knows what he's going to do before he actually does it is because Secretary of War Stanton is acting as a spy. So he's very angry about this. But before Johnson could do anything about it, the House and the Senate had passed a law to protect him. And the name of that law is the Tenure of Office Act. Tenure is spelled Tenure. It's not 10-year, it's tenure. Like teachers like myself, I have tenure as a professor, which means I can't be fired for silly things like if the administration didn't like the fact that I never wear a tie to work, I wear jeans a lot of the time. That's tough luck for them. I have tenure. The only way they could fire me is if I was not doing my job or I was completely insubordinate to my superiors. So, they passed this act, and what this act basically does is it gives cabinet officials tenure. And here's how it works. When you're appointed as a cabinet official, like the Secretary of War, or Secretary of Treasury, or Secretary of State, whatnot. The president nominates you. Then the Senate holds hearings on your capabilities, your background, and so forth. And then they vote either to accept that appointment and make you Secretary of Defense in Stanton's case, or they reject the appointment and make the president pick a new appointee. So, what Congress is doing here with this Tenure of Office Act is they're operating on this premise. Since the Senate has to approve all hirings of cabinet officials, then they should approve all firings of cabinet officials. So if the president wants to fire, in this case, Secretary of War Stanton, he should have to ask the Senate to hold hearings, and then they decide, yes, you can fire him, no, you can't. So they'll pass this act in 1867. Obviously, President Johnson will veto it, but it doesn't really matter at this point. The Republicans have a 2/3 majority in both houses, so they override his veto. So, Johnson has discovered Stanton is the spy. He makes an announcement. Secretary of War Stanton is fired. I can't work with somebody who's disloyal. I don't care what law Congress has passed. He's fired. He's done. So when that happens, all hell breaks loose in Washington. The first thing that happens, Secretary of War Stanton refuses to leave office. In fact, he even barricades himself in his office for several days and will not leave. And basically what his argument is, the Tenure of Office Act exists. He can't just fire me. He has to ask the Senate for permission. President Johnson said, I'm not asking anybody. This guy's disloyal. He's got to go. I can't have him working for me. So what's going to happen next is, because this is breaking a federal law, the House of Representatives starts an investigation. And they'll send people, representatives of the House, over to the White House to speak with the president. And basically they'll question him and they'll say, okay, Mr. President, we understand you've fired Secretary of War Stanton. Is this correct? Yes. Do you realize that the Tenure of Office Act exists and you must ask the Senate for their permission to fire him? He says, yes, I understand that it exists, but I think it's unconstitutional and I'm not going to abide by it. He's fired, period. So the investigators report back to the House. The House of Representatives will then take the first step in impeachment and they will pass articles of impeachment. Now, let me refresh your memory. It should be pretty good on this because you just went through this with President Trump's impeachment. The House can investigate anything the president does. If they find things they believe are worthy of impeachment, then they pass what's known as articles of impeachment. That means the president is impeached. Being impeached does not mean tossed out of office. Here's the best way to think of it. It's like being indicted by a grand jury. If you're accused of a serious crime like murder or whatever, the local county prosecutor will put together a grand jury where the prosecutor will present the evidence they have against you. Then this grand jury of citizens decides if there's enough evidence to make you go through the trying situation of standing trial for a serious crime. If they don't think the prosecutor has enough evidence, they'll refuse to indict, then you don't go to trial. So, the House is acting basically sort of as a grand jury. The articles of impeachment are like an indictment. So now Johnson is indicted or impeached in this case. So the next step in the process that you should well remember is a trial takes place. And that trial takes place in the U.S. Senate. All the senators are sworn in like a giant jury. And the House has a team of members of the House and attorneys they've hired and so forth to present their case against the president on the information they've gathered in their investigations, and they act like a prosecutor. They try to convict the president. The president can put together a team of attorneys, members of the House themselves, to be there to defend them. Presidents do not have to appear in front of the Senate and testify if they don't want to. Just like in a regular case, you don't have to testify against yourself. There's never been a president who testified in front of the Senate. Johnson won't. President Clinton didn't. Obviously, President Trump didn't either. So, in order to convict a person, namely the president, but remember, presidents aren't the only ones who can be impeached. Cabinet officials can, Supreme Court justices can, and so forth. But what you're most familiar with is presidential impeachment. So to convict, it requires a 2/3 majority of the senators to vote guilty. Then the president would be found guilty of the articles of impeachment and then would be removed from office. Now, everybody thought Johnson was a dead duck. The Republicans have a 2/3 majority. This is just, they're putting it on for show. They don't like him. They'll hear it all. They'll vote and throw him out of office. Well, here's what happens. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed. And President Johnson missed being removed from office or found guilty by one single vote. They missed the 2/3 majority by one vote. Now, I say luckily. This would have created a horrible precedent. And let me explain what I'm talking about. Let's think about what happened here with President Johnson. President Johnson was hated by Congress. They had a spy in his cabinet. They knew he'd find out sooner or later, so they passed the Tenure of Office Act, which was more or less a legal trap. They waited for Johnson, who they knew was foolish enough to step into their trap. He did. They caught him, put him on trial, convict him, throw him out of office. It was basically a setup by the radical Republicans. Some of them, after they thought about it, decided this isn't the way the system works. Who's supposed to throw the president out of office if they don't like the way that he's behaving and the policies? Not Congress. The voters are. Unless the president commits crimes of a very serious nature, then it's the job of the House and the Senate to remove the president. They created the law he broke. This would just set up a horrible circumstance that in the future, every time Congress didn't like a president, they'd pass some sort of law they know he would break, catch him, and throw him out. That's not the way the Constitution is supposed to operate. So because of this, look at the long time before we had another impeachment of a president. We went all the way until 1974 with Richard Nixon, who had articles of impeachment passed against him for the Watergate affair. Before they could even hold the trial in the Senate, Richard Nixon resigned because he knew he was guilty and he'd be a goner. So we went from 1867 all the way to 1974. But even that created some political unrest. Republicans held a grudge. They went after Bill Clinton for questionable circumstances as far as being an impeachable offense. The Democrats were angry about that, held a grudge, went after President Trump for his phone call business. This whole impeachment nonsense, unless there's an actual serious crime that you can prove and convict on, has to end. We'll see what the future holds. So, President Johnson survives the rest of his time in the White House. Why throw him out anyway? He's powerless. He can veto anything he wants, and Congress can override every single veto. Congress just does what they want anyway, and Johnson just does his time in the White House, and obviously is not running for re-election in 1868 when that election rolls around. So, the next thing I want to talk to you about today is a really positive thing that happened during the Johnson administration as far as something being put in place by his administration, and there weren't many, as you've probably figured out by now. That's the purchase of Alaska in 1867. So let me tell you the background information on how we ended up buying Alaska from Russia. Now, Alaska was a Russian colony. Alaska had been colonized by the Russians, who were the first to explore there in the early 1700s, and they established a Russian colony there. They still held that colony in 1867. Now, in 1867, Russia was in a depression, and their country was basically broke, and they're in dire straits, and they needed to raise money fast. So they will approach Secretary of State William Seward from New York. The Seward House is in Auburn, New York. If you're ever over in the Finger Lakes, great place to tour. And they'll ask him if he'd be interested in purchasing Alaska from the Russian government. Now, the reason why the Russians came to us, besides the fact that it's in North America, they weren't willing to potentially sell it to England because they weren't on very good terms with England at the time, who controlled Canada still. And they were on very good terms with the United States government. In fact, during the Civil War, right off the bat, when the Confederates left the Union, the Russian government failed to recognize them as a country and only recognized the Union as the true United States government. They're one of the few countries to do that. England recognized the Confederacy and carried on trade with them. So did France. And as we know, England toyed around with the idea of entering the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. The thing that put that to a screeching halt was the great Union victory at Gettysburg. That was part of Lee's strategy invading the North into Pennsylvania. He wanted to prove he could win a battle on Union soil, which he obviously could not. So, the Russians felt comfortable coming to us. Secretary of Seward said, sure, let me pursue this. So, the next step, this is going to be a treaty between Russia and the United States. Treaties are ratified by the United States Senate. So Secretary of Seward, who's been on the cabinet all the way since 1861, goes to the Senate and testifies, trying to convince them to purchase Alaska from the Russians for the bargain discount price of $7.2 million. Now, first, let me explain to you why that's such a bargain. Back in 1803, we paid France $15 million for the Louisiana Purchase. Obviously, this is nearly 60 years later. Well, it's more than 60 years later. And we're getting a piece of property that's comparable in size to the Louisiana Territory for basically half price, with that many years behind it. So, Seward's going to have his work cut out for him, though, because Americans aren't familiar with Alaska. They think, when they think of Alaska, they think of Siberia, they think of a frozen wasteland, and Seward was the butt of a lot of jokes, either said, behind his back by senators or the press or whatever. A lot of people referred to Alaska as Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. And remember, most of it, 99.9% of Americans have never even been to Alaska before. They had no clue what it was like. So, Seward basically talks the Senate into it. They begrudgingly ratify the treaty, excuse me, and we purchase Alaska for the bargain discount price of $7.2 million. I was wrong before, I told you 7.6. Now, we're lucky Secretary of Seward was a man of vision. He knew this was important for America to expand the territory in a time when we couldn't expand anywhere else. That was about it. Would only help us, and boy did it help us in the future. Economically, think about it. I'd be willing to bet that more than $7.2 million worth of oil flows out of the Alaska pipeline on a daily basis. Tremendous resources in Alaska. Think about the fisheries. A large portion of the world's salmon comes from the shores and the waters of Alaska. It's a natural paradise. It's an environmental wonder. It's a great place, and it's not a polar bear garden, as some people tried to say it was. So, on another point, which makes it extremely important, let's just think about if we'd have said no, and Russia would have hung on to it. Still possessed it today, still possessed it in the 60s. Many of you have probably read about, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I got to get a drink of water here. Thanks for bearing with me. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union put missiles on the island of Cuba. And that created a nuclear standoff where the Kennedy administration demanded those missiles be removed because they're in a foreign country's property and they're only 90 miles from the shores of the United States, namely southern Florida. This created a major standoff. Finally, the Soviet Union agreed to dismantle those missile sites and remove them. If they would have still owned Alaska, they could have put nuclear missiles in the southern portions of Alaska that would have had the capability of delivering a missile to San Francisco in 4 minutes. That would have created a complete nuclear standoff, and we wouldn't have been able to say, hey, remove those missiles from Alaska, because Alaska would have been Russian territory, and they put missiles any damn place they want to, as long as it's their territory. Today with Putin, I wouldn't want him a neighbor up in Alaska under no circumstances. I don't know what anybody else thinks about him, but I don't trust him as far as I could throw him. So, that's it for today. When we pick up next, we're going to start talking about politics during the Gilded Age. So I'm going to first of all explain to you what's meant by that term, Gilded Age with the next lecture. So I'm going to take a break here, drink a little more water. I'm getting hoarse, and I'll be back with you in a few minutes. See you soon.